One night, nearly 250 years ago, a ship ran aground on a treacherous reef in the Pacific Ocean.
Ship's aground!
Water poured into a wooden hull, threatening to sink her and drown all those on board. The ship that faced a watery grave appeared to be nothing more than an unremarkable coaling vessel, captained by an unknown commander on an obscure scientific field trip. But this ship had a secret mission, one that would redraw the map of the world and make a hero of her undistinguished leader.
The ship was called the Endeavour, and her commander was Captain James Cook. This is the incredible story of one of the greatest sea adventures in history. A voyage that would transform James Cook from a naval nobody into a national hero.
He'd hang all politicians, hooray, boys, hooray! He'd make work for morticians,
Hey, boys, hey.
2.5 centuries after his adventures, Captain Cook is a household name. But the story is often misunderstood. People think he discovered New Zealand and this place, Australia. But in truth, he didn't. But his story is no less remarkable. As an explorer myself, I'm astonished by his achievements. And I want to tell you the real story of Captain Cook.
The Endeavour sailed from Plymouth on the 26th of August, 1768. It was the age of enlightenment, an era of intellectual ferment. Huge advances were being made in the fields of science, literature, and the exploration of the globe. Officially, the Endeavour was on a scientific mission to measure an astronomical phenomenon, the transit of Venus, the rare moment when Venus crosses in front of the Sun. If successfully observed, these measurements would enable astronomers to calculate the distance between the Earth and the Sun, a figure which could then be used to measure the dimensions of the solar system itself.
The ship's orders were to measure the transit from the middle of the South Pacific, the other side of the world. But this wasn't the only reason for the mission, because on board was a second set of instructions, and these were marked secret.
These sealed instructions contained the real mission of the voyage, and no one, not even the ship's commander, knew where they would lead them. The 94-man crew reflected the spirit of the age. As well as an astronomer, the Endeavour included amongst her ranks 2 scientists and 2 artists. And they were all under the command of James Cook.
Of course, today, James Cook is world famous. But at the time of the Endeavour voyage, he was a complete unknown. In fact, Captain Cook wasn't even a captain. He was a lieutenant. And in the Royal Navy, at the time in 1768, there were 300 captains and over 900 lieutenants, which shows you how far down the naval hierarchy he really was.
Indeed, Lieutenant Cook appeared to be a surprising choice for the mission. His career had begun inauspiciously. As Cook himself wrote,
"I am a man who has not the advantage of education, nor natural abilities for writing, but one who has constantly been at sea from his youth as apprentice boy in the coal trade."
After a decade on board the coaling ships of northeast England, Cook enlisted as an able seaman in the Royal Navy, rising to the rank of ship's master. 12 years on, he had never made a voyage as long as the one now proposed, and had commanded nothing bigger than a humble schooner.
Cook faced a problem that held him back. Class. Cook was a reserved farmer's son from Yorkshire, not the right candidate for the class-obsessed Royal Navy. This is why, by the ripe age of 40, he hadn't risen up the ranks. And why the Admiralty, after picking him to lead the expedition, kept him at arm's length, refusing to promote him to captain. So they gave him the responsibility, but not the rank.
They ultimately chose Cook because, working class or not, they knew he possessed the skills that made him perfectly fitted to this mission. He'd proved himself to be a skilled navigator and surveyor, and even more appropriately, had developed a fascination with astronomy. For Cook, this expedition was his chance to prove himself. At last, here was the opportunity to reveal his talents, to show that class was no barrier to achievement.
That's good, lads. Keep it there.
But it was a huge challenge. To carry out his mission, Cook would have to navigate his ship to the other side of the world, battling treacherous seas and dangerous currents.
James, it's a beautiful day on a flat, calm Sydney harbour. I mean, what's it like to sail these boats in rough weather on big passages? You've made those passages.
Yeah, well, you get all kinds of weather. You get this sort of weather around the tropics, but in the southern latitudes and in the high latitudes, you know, it's cold, rough, ship rolls heavily. Yeah. You've got to be up the mast there sometimes. She's rolling and pitching very violently.
And of course, in Cook's day, they would have had no backup whatsoever. I mean, if you and me recreated this journey, we'd have modern comms and modern navigation. We would always know we had some backup.
It was a long way from home. There was no communication, like a ship lost in space. But, couldn't call Mum.
To make things worse, the Endeavour sailed alone. It was usual for ships on these journeys to travel with support vessels in case they got into trouble. What's more, she was just a basic workman-like coaling vessel, certainly not glamorous. And as she plodded south, she looked like the most unlikely ship in the world to be making history.
As if that wasn't enough, there was the question of whether Cook could even sustain a crew fit enough to sail his lone ship across the world.
Can you imagine 100 men crammed together on a small ship just like this one, 100 feet long? Conditions below must have been appalling, let alone the smell. And disease was rife. And even though Cook was incredibly strict about keeping his men and the ship clean, there was one disease that cleanliness couldn't prevent: scurvy.
Over the years, Cook has been acclaimed as the man who discovered the cure for the terrible disease of scurvy. But in fact, it's not quite so simple. The true story goes back centuries. Scurvy was the scourge of the Navy. It was a particularly gruesome way to die. Gums bled, teeth fell out, limbs seized up, ulcers broke out, old wounds reopened, and most revoltingly, gum tissue oozed out of the mouth and began to rot, making the victim's breath stink. Death must have come as a blessed release. The disease decimated crews. In the 300 years before Cook's journey on the Endeavour, over 2 million sailors had died from scurvy. A captain could expect to lose at least 40% of his men, a figure often rising to 80%.
Cook was faced with a massive problem. Very little was known about scurvy, and there was no agreement at all as to what caused it or what might even prevent it. Some believed it was caused by bad air, thickening of the blood, lack of oxygen, sadness, or even the fat being skimmed off the boiling pots on board the ship. And the treatments were even more bizarre, including bloodletting, bathing in animals' blood, or having the poor victim buried up to his neck in the sand. Of course, none of them worked. Hey. Hi, Nigel.
Hi, Paul. Nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. Come on board, mate.
But astonishingly, some people had stumbled upon the real cure for scurvy during the previous 200 years. So, Nigel, who were these people who found the cure for scurvy?
Well, Ronsius, a Dutch physician in the middle of the 17th century, had noted a cure. And then with the East India Company ships coming out across the Indian Ocean, there'd been a fellow called Woodall, who was a surgeon. He'd noted one of the cures straight away, right in about 1636.
Crikey, I mean, this was a long time before Cook's voyage.
A long, long time. One of the problems, of course, was that these people weren't just noting one cure. It was, one of a number of things, and it wasn't as clear as it is to us today.
So what did Cook do on the Endeavour to try and prevent scurvy?
Well, he was told to take a number of anti-scorbutics, literally things which are meant to cure scurvy. He took wort, which is a kind of infusion made with malt. He took portable soup, which was like a large stock cube, things that you mixed up with your wheat and served it up as a gruel. One of the main things he introduced was this stuff, sauerkraut.
It's pickled cabbage.
OK, try some. OK, let's have a go. Blimey. Oh, wow. It's not the best. Particularly if you're going to eat it for 3 years, right?
Very much an acquired taste.
Holy smokes.
Cook hoped that his special diet would work, but making sure the men stuck to it was no easy matter. After 2 months at sea, some of the crew had had enough of the ship's rations. On the 16th of September, 2 men rebelled against the rigid diet. As Cook noted in his daily journal, punishment was swift and severe.
Punished Henry Stevens, seaman, and Thomas Dunister, marine, with 12 lashes each for refusing to take their allowance of fresh beef.
This punishment might seem harsh for the crime, but the lash was a regular part of Navy life, and a refusal to obey orders was tantamount to mutiny.
This punishment shows how determined Cook was to keep his men healthy. He was essentially a very humane man. Other captains would have dished out 24 lashings for such an offence. In fact, Cook preferred to use a bit of psychology rather than the lash to get the men to obey his orders. And the next time there was reluctance to eat the diet that he'd prepared, he came up with a great plan. The men hated the sauerkraut that he'd put in their diet, so he took it off their menu and just kept it on the officers' menu instead. Of course, overnight, sauerkraut became the most desired dish on board.
For such are the tempers and dispositions of seamen in general, that the moment they saw their superiors set a value on it, it becomes the finest stuff in the world, and the inventor a damned honest fellow.
Despite Cook's careful diet, scurvy wasn't completely banished from the decks of the Endeavour. The disease struck many of the crew, including one of the most vital members of the expedition, Joseph Banks.
10 veins aside.
Banks was a young, fantastically wealthy playboy who had effectively bought his way onto the ship. He'd paid £10,000, over £1 million in today's money, for his place on board, more than twice as much as the official state funding of the expedition.
Approximately 10 veins.
And all to indulge his personal passion, botany. Banks brought with him an entourage of fellow botanists and artists, whose task was to collect and study the new plants encountered on the voyage. He also brought with him, as any English gentleman would do, 2 greyhounds. But right now, Banks's whole project, not to mention his life, was threatened by scurvy. At first, he tried to treat it by drinking a pint of wort each night, but to no effect. Then he tried another remedy.
I flew to the lemon juice. The effect was surprising. In less than a week, my gums became as firm as ever. And at this time, I am troubled with nothing but a few pimples on my face.
So Banks had actually stumbled across the cure for scurvy. It was the vitamin C in fresh fruit and vegetables, particularly citrus fruits like these beauties. But neither Banks nor Cook knew really if they'd found the remedy or not.
They still saw the lemon juice as one possible cure amongst many. But as the Endeavour sailed on, it became clear that Cook's strategy was working. Despite a few scares, nobody was actually dying from scurvy. In 1768, this was unheard of. Cook might not have known about vitamin C, present even in the sauerkraut, but by enforcing his rigid diet in the first place, he was making medical and naval history. From the voyage of the Endeavour onwards, the Admiralty recognised the crucial importance of diet. Limes became standard on all British voyages, hence the nickname Limeys, and deaths fell dramatically.
Anybody else?
After 5 months at sea, the voyage appeared to be going well. Cook had scurvy under control and the ship was making good time. But they were still 8,000 kilometres from the heart of the South Pacific, where they were to carry out their mission, and the worst part of the passage was yet to come.
The voyage was about to enter its most dangerous part, the treacherous waters around Cape Horn at the bottom of South America. These waters are regarded as amongst the most dangerous in the world, with big storms, huge waves, fog and icebergs, and Cook had to sail right through them.
The Endeavour was battered by fierce storms, and Cook was forced to make 3 failed attempts to enter the waters around the Cape. Finally, on his 4th attempt, sailing against strong winds and currents, the Endeavour made it through the passage. Cook was beginning to show the character that would make him great. Rod Fleck is Cook's great-great-great-nephew.
What kind of person do you think he was?
I feel that he was a very humane and he liked people. He wouldn't do anything nasty to a person. He had a gentle disposition, very reserved, quiet, a kind and gentle person. He had the natural ability, I feel, to pick up things and learn and go through, and apart from that, he could carry it forward. There's a lot of people who learn, but they can never go through and do the things, and I feel that's what he had.
So that would really help his credibility as a leader of men, I would think.
Isaac Smith said, which he went on a few voyages with him, a later admiral, he said that he was feared but loved by his crew. Feared because of the lash, but they loved him. That's it.
Wow. What more can you say about someone like that?
Yeah.
As the Endeavour sailed on across the Pacific, the seas became calmer and the weather more tropical. As the voyage progressed, the ship made various stops, which provided Banks and his party with the opportunity to collect new plant specimens and shoot previously unknown animals and birds. Cook's cabin rapidly became flooded with all kinds of strange and unfamiliar plant and animal life. Then, on the 13th of April 1769, after 33 weeks at sea, land was finally spotted. Cook had arrived at the South Pacific island that would hopefully make his name. It was here in Tahiti that he was to carry out his mission and measure the transit of Venus. The Endeavour had arrived in paradise. This was a land of plenty and sexual liberation, where fruit fell from the trees and beautiful women offered themselves freely. But Cook had important work to do, work that could potentially widen our understanding of the universe and finally prove his abilities.
Cook had successfully sailed halfway around the world. Now he had to prove himself as an astronomer, and he knew he had just one chance of getting his measurement right. And although he was just one of 77 observers around the world measuring the transit, he was the most important, because he was the only one in the southern hemisphere. And that was the only place in the world where you could clearly see the transit from beginning to end. And as if that wasn't enough pressure, the transit of Venus is an incredibly rare event, and it wouldn't happen again for another 105 years.
Cook immediately began to prepare for the transit. But before work in Tahiti began, he gave his crew some highly unusual instructions.
You are to endeavour, by every fair means, to cultivate a friendship with the natives and to treat them with all imaginable humanity.
Cook's orders were extraordinarily radical. In the 18th century, most explorers' idea of cooperating with indigenous peoples was to go in with guns blazing. But Cook preferred negotiation over brute force, making friends rather than enemies.
In the event, there was no need for violence. The people of Tahiti proved to be warm, open and welcoming. Banks wrote lyrically,
If we quarrel with those Indians, we should not agree with angels.
but the Tahitians did possess one annoying trait. It started as an irritation, but was to escalate into something much more serious. They liked to steal.
It was a hard matter to keep them out of the ship as they climbed like monkeys. But it was still harder to keep them from stealing but everything that came within their reach. In this, they are prodigious experts.
Metal was an especially attractive commodity to the Tahitians, and it wasn't long before all kinds of things were going missing, including snuff boxes and opera glasses. And the Endeavour store of iron nails were an especially attractive commodity, particularly once the crew realised that a handful of them could be swapped for sex with the local women.
But petty thieving soon turned into disaster. One morning, one of the most vital pieces of equipment for measuring the transit, the astronomical quadrant, was discovered missing. Without it, the measurement of the transit could not take place.
Banks found out from a local chieftain the name of the thief and the direction that he'd headed, and he set off running after him. Through the blazing heat and through the jungle, across the island for 11 kilometres. It wasn't long before great hordes of Tahitians turned out to see who would win and what the outcome would be. Eventually, Banks found the quadrant discarded by the side of the trail. The thief had just thrown it away. The stage was set for measuring the transit.
The day dawned and the omens were good. The skies were crystal clear. As the thermometer rose to 119 degrees, Cook and his team of observers trained their telescopes on the sun. Astronomer Wayne Orkiston has studied the astronomical mission. I asked him how Cook measured the transit of Venus.
Well, let me show you. I mean, you've got the ideal T-shirt there.
Certainly do.
We've got the sun there, and we've got this beautiful little nut, which we're going to represent as Venus, and what we want to do is observe the transit of Venus as it travels across the sun. So here's Venus, approaches the edge of the sun, onto the sun, and then exits the sun. Now, that transect from here to here is going to take about 6.5 hours. What we want to do to determine the transit accurately is record precisely when Venus is just on the edge of the sun but outside it, on the edge of the sun but inside it, so just touching the limb of the sun as we call it. We call that first and second contacts, and then the third contact is just as it approaches and touches the edge of the sun, and fourth contact as it leaves. And it's those 4 contact points and the times of them that are critical. And we observe those by looking through the telescope, observing Venus as it approaches the sun, and then with the clock which we've got adjacent to the telescope recording the times.
But as Venus crept in front of the sun, Cook realised he had a major problem on his hands.
When Venus enters the sun, once it gets to this point, second contact, in fact, Venus has got an atmosphere around it, so you see a hazy shadow, a bit like the atmosphere of the Earth, around Venus. And so it's very hard to know exactly when Venus gets right onto the sun. And you'll find that as it moves further and further onto the sun, you end up with a little strip of shadow linking the edge of the sun. So when do you decide that in fact second contact's occurred? Is it here, or is it here, or here?
When Cook compared the timings of the transit, they didn't tally. The measurements varied by nearly a minute, and he needed them to be exact. Now it seemed Cook had travelled halfway round the world, only for his mission to end in failure. But another opportunity was about to present itself, one even greater than the measurement of the transit. Cook's real mission was only just beginning. It was time to open the secret instructions. If achieved, these orders would transform Britain into the richest and most powerful nation on Earth and turn Cook into a national hero.
You are to proceed to the southward in order to make discovery of the continent until you arrive in the latitude of 40 degrees, unless you sooner fall in with it.
The real purpose of Cook's mission was now revealed: the discovery of the fabled Great Southern Continent.
Hey, John. Thanks for letting me on.
Oh, you're welcome.
Right, give me something to do.
Well, we need to get that Genoa out.
Righto, mate. Here we go. In the 18th century, it was widely assumed that there was a great southern continent somewhere in the South Pacific. They were so confident it was there, it was as certain as the sun and the moon exists. It was even given a name: Terra Australis Incognita, unknown land of the south. It was somewhere out there.
The notion of the Great Southern Continent dates from the classical world. The ancient Greeks had theorised about its existence in the 1st century AD. And by the Renaissance, scientists argued that since the Earth was spherical, there must be a great landmass in the southern hemisphere to counterbalance the vast continents of the north. And this was no ordinary continent. By the 18th century, it was believed it covered most of the southern hemisphere, a far greater landmass than anything we now know to exist. All somebody needed to do was find it. This lost continent was imagined to be a paradise on Earth, a land overflowing with natural riches. Whichever nation claimed it first stood to reap massive rewards, exploiting the continent's vast riches and commanding trading and military routes in the Pacific. It had become the holy grail of empire and exploration.
This explains why Cook's orders were secret. The British government didn't want their foreign rivals to know that there was an expedition afoot to find the Great Southern Continent. And what better cover for the mission than a simple coaling ship on a science expedition to measure the transit of Venus? The British government wanted to get to the southern continent first and in secret.
In an era when undiscovered land represented power and wealth, there was intense competition to find this elusive continent.
This globe shows us all that was known of the world in the 1750s.
and it was believed that the Great Southern Continent was somewhere around here in the South Pacific. In fact, it was even given an exact location, 40 degrees south, and a length 8,000 kilometres long. Cook's instructions were therefore to sail further south in the Pacific than any man had ever gone before. 40 degrees latitude, in search of the Great Southern Continent. And so, the Endeavour's great adventure into the unknown began. Overnight, the mission was transformed from a scientific field trip into a true voyage of discovery. Cook had been given a second chance, one that would stretch his skills to the limit. He was about to be really tested for the first time in his life, sailing into virgin seas. Cook would need all his skills as a navigator and leader to sail his small wooden ship and her crew into the unknown. What really fascinates me is how Cook navigated. He crossed thousands of kilometres across the Pacific that had never been charted. And he only had very, very basic navigational instruments. He had no accurate charts, no land masses to get sights from, no accurate way of measuring distance, and it would have been a huge challenge. I mean, these days on long passages, I've got a GPS, like many people these days, very simple satellite receiver. And it takes in satellite signals and tells me exactly where I am. I'm reading it now, ready to navigate, accuracy 3 metres, anywhere in the world. Cook wouldn't have had anything like this. But what Cook did have was his fascination with astronomy, a hobby that would now serve him well. Cook measured the movement of the sun, the moon and the stars with a sextant, and compared his readings with tables of lunar predictions. Then, with some complex calculations, he came up with an incredibly accurate reading for his longitude, the ship's position east-west. Cook was one of the first sailors ever to determine a ship's location with such pinpoint accuracy. Cook kept his course, sailing ever further south, in search of the Great Southern Continent. The crew's eyes remained fixed on the horizon. There was an occasional false alarm when cloud formations were mistaken for land. But after 3 weeks of sailing south, the ship reached 40 degrees. There was no sign of Terra Australis Incognita. And with Cook's experience of the sea, he could tell from the swell of the ocean and the trend of the currents that there was no great landmass anywhere nearby. Cook's orders told him that if he couldn't find the continent at 40 degrees south, he was to sail west in search of it instead. So the Endeavour changed course. For a month she sailed west. Cook offered a gallon of rum to the first person to sight the coast, and still the continent stubbornly refused to appear. Then, on the 6th of October 1769, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, an excited voice shouted out the words that everyone had been longing to hear.
Land ahoy! Land ahoy! Yes!
Yeah! Land had been sighted, and a single substantial landmass at that. It seemed that Cook had at last made one of the greatest discoveries in history. He'd found the Great Southern Continent. So now he went ashore to explore this promising new land.
This land is agreeable beyond description, and with proper cultivation might be rendered a kind of second paradise. The hills are covered with beautiful flowering shrubs, intermingled with a sort of tall and stately palms, which filled the air with a most grateful, fragrant perfume.
To the continents!
Joseph Banks was swept up by the romance of the discovery.
Much difference of opinion and many conjectures about islands, rivers, inlets, etc. But all hands seem to agree that this is certainly the continent we are in search of.
You have made this possible.
Cook began to fully investigate this eastern coastline, sailing north, painstakingly charting the unknown land as he went. As Cook sailed round the northern tip of the land and down its west coast, he realised he was following a stretch of coastline that had been explored and charted before. It had, 130 years earlier. You can see it, this is a little squiggle in the South Pacific. And it was speculated that that could have been part of the great southern continent. Seemed that if Cook had done it, he'd found the Holy Grail. At last, success was in Cook's grasp. But as the Endeavour charted more of the coastline, Cook was to be sorely disappointed. The Endeavour eventually reached a stretch of water which Cook christened Queen Charlotte Sound. He anchored and began to explore the surrounding countryside. When Cook was a boy in Yorkshire, he grew up in the shadow of Rosebery Topping, a large hill that he climbed all the time. An entirely natural thing for kids and explorers to do, get up and have a look around. And habit never left him. So sure enough, when he arrived at Queen Charlotte Sound, he went up a hill to have a look. And what he saw was just extraordinary. There was a large stretch of water between the land he'd just sailed around and him, which meant it wasn't a continent at all. It was just an island. In fact, Cook had become the first European to sail around the land we now know as the North Island of New Zealand, and he was about to discover its South Island. But these two small islands certainly weren't the great, rich continent that he'd been in search of.
This country, which before now was thought to be part of the imaginary southern continent, consists of two large islands. As to a southern continent, I do not believe any such thing exists.
This was an astonishing claim to make. Cook had just sailed straight across the part of the Pacific where the great southern continent was supposed to be, and it wasn't there. The dream of the great continent was in tatters. Cook knew it would have been a lot better if he had found the continent, rather than proved it wasn't there. Because after all, his masters desperately wanted it to exist. Yet again, the promise of success had been snatched from Cook's grasp. The discovery of the great southern continent would have made Cook's name, but he was not to be defeated. He may not have found the continent, but Cook was determined to seize victory and discover other unknown lands. He made a remarkable decision. Cook knew that to the northwest of New Zealand was a vast land that had yet to be fully explored. Even though the Dutch had surveyed the north, west and south coasts, the vast eastern coast had never even been seen by Europeans. It was called New Holland. And Cook proposed that they survey the whole length of it to its northernmost point, and only then would they sail home via the East Indies. It was an extraordinary proposal, one that went way over and above the normal call of duty. Something in Cook had been awoken, a hunger that would drive him into the history books. He was now gripped by a desire to explore and discover. And that's exactly how it happens. It can't be denied. It's so powerful. It happened to me off the south coast of Britain. I was 17, diving at 30 metres for the very first time on a small wreck. And I just knew that this is all I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I was just so happy I'd left school, so happy I hadn't gone to college or university, and I just wanted to be amongst it. I wanted to get out and explore. And I reckon something like that happened to Cook at this time. Cook sailed the Endeavour west, again venturing into the unknown. Then, 20 days after leaving New Zealand, the east coast of New Holland was seen by European eyes for the very first time.
On the 29th of April 1770, nearly 2 years after leaving Britain, Endeavour sailed into this bay. Cook and his crew came ashore and stepped onto these very rocks and became the first Europeans ever to land on the east coast of New Holland, Australia.
Cook might not have discovered Australia, but he was the first to chart its huge east coast, completing the map of the country. And he was the first to claim this vast, rich land for Britain.
James, what must it have been like for the indigenous people here to have seen Cook and his men arrive?
It would have been like seeing a UFO for the first time. You know, a UFO, unidentified floating object, mate. You know, and it came through the heads and all those sorts of things, and from its inside, these strange ghost-coloured people would have came out with, you know, all these coloured clothes on, skins and all that sort of thing, and sand-coloured faces, and carrying these strange implements like a funny-shaped spear and all those sorts of things, and it would have been awe-inspiring to them, if you know what I mean.
What did Cook think of the local people when he first got here?
I think Cook had some very, very enlightened views of the people here. He started asking questions. He noticed all these strange animals around, and he was asking the Guugu Yimada, you know, what's this, what's that? And they saw this, what was like this animal. The Guugu Yimada turned around and said, you know, looked at the kangaroo. And the Guugu Yimada turned around and said, well, I don't know, be more specific. I don't know, be more specific. And so they called this animal a kangaroo. But in the language of the Guugu Yimada, kangaroo meant, I don't know. I don't know.
Classic misunderstanding.
Classic misunderstanding.
But it wasn't only new people that Cook and his crew found in Australia. Banks and his team soon discovered huge numbers of important specimens of flora and fauna, totally unknown in Europe.
The great quantity of new plants, etc., Mr. Banks collected in this place occasioned my giving it the name of Botanist Harbour, Botanist Bay, Botany Bay.
Doug Benson, a local botanist, has studied Banks's work on board the Endeavour.
What did he collect here at Botany Bay?
Well, he collected at least 130 species, including this Banksia serrata here, this old man Banksia, which unfortunately, because it's winter, hasn't got its pale yellow flowers, but it's a lovely plant.
It's a beautiful looking tree. So out of all the things that Banks collected, how much collecting did he do on the whole voyage?
Oh, he collected something like 30,000 specimens, but that includes plants, birds, insects, fish and so on.
So what would you say was his contribution to science?
I think he gets botany going. He really provides this drive. Certainly he is the most influential botanical figure, probably in Australia's early history. And in fact, it's as a botanist myself, it's rather exciting to see that botany features so strongly in the early history of Australia.
It was this land that Cook claimed for Britain, an act that was to change the course of history. Though Cook's actions were to make his name, their legacy may not have been in tune with his liberal thinking.
Of course, Cook is seen as being the father of modern Australia, but he played no part in the colonising of this land. It was Joseph Banks' idea, 9 years after Cook's death, that Botany Bay should be the home of a penal colony. So the British became the first European nation to settle this land. And they sent cargo after cargo of convicts.
Australia would never be the same again.
The indigenous people around here, those people had a structure. You know, they already had a political system, a social system already set up. They had education for their children and all those sorts of things. They had a 40,000-year structure of living here. You know, they knew what to do with the land and all those sorts of things, but in our perspective, not yours.
And if that structure was so successful for 40,000 years, how is it that it couldn't resist the structure of the Europeans coming in?
You were the most powerful group of people on Earth at that particular point in time. You had better ships, you knew the currents, you knew navigation and all those sorts of things. You had the weapon, the gun, that funny-shaped spear that made a great noise and killed birds and animals 2 or 3 spear throws away. Right, my people would have said, what the hell's that? You know what I mean? But you also came with your invisible luggage. And those the attitudes and values, you know, that you also brought racism to this country.
On the 6th of May 1770, the Endeavour sailed further north up the coast. She'd been away from home for nearly 2 years and had travelled to the other side of the world. Surely Cook had now proved his worth. He might not have found the great southern continent, but his ship was loaded with discoveries that would change our understanding of the world forever. Maps of new lands, astronomical readings, and thousands of botanical specimens. But, unknown to Cook, ruin was lurking beneath the waves. He had no way of knowing it, but he was sailing towards some of the most treacherous shallows on the planet. Ahead of him lay the vastness of the Great Barrier Reef. This reef stretches for a massive 1,900 kilometres along the east coast of Australia. It's so big, you can see it from space. And for a wooden 18th century sailing ship, it was a disaster waiting to happen. It's beautiful down here, one of the most spectacular dives anywhere on the planet. But this beauty belies great danger. The coral is made up of limestone. It's hard as rock and razor sharp.
And if you look here, you can see how close the reef lies to the surface. In fact, at low tide, it's virtually at the surface. Now these days, modern ships have sonar to warn them of shallow water. But all Cook had was his eyesight and a weighted rope. You can imagine what it would be like to try to see this from above, especially at night. It would have been virtually impossible.
At 11 o'clock, in the evening of the 10th of June 1770, Cook was asleep in bed as the Endeavour made her way slowly northwards. Success appeared to be finally within his grasp. The Endeavour had crashed into the Great Barrier Reef, bringing her to a sudden halt.
Scarce were we warm in our beds when we were called up with the alarming news of the ship being fast ashore upon a rock, which she in a few moments convinced us of by beating very violently against the rocks. Our situation became now greatly alarming.
The reef had punctured a hole right in the hull of the ship. The water was pouring in. But the worst problem was that the ship was pinned onto the reef and wouldn't budge. wrecked, and the men would be drowned. Because none of them could swim. And the only way Cook could get enough water to float Endeavour was to wait for high tide.
In order to stand any chance of saving his ship and her crew, Cook needed to make her as light as possible before the tide rose again. As day dawned, Cook ordered 50 tons of heavy material to be thrown overboard. Everything from cannons to ballast and barrels. As the day drew on, Cook knew he'd done all he feasibly could to save the ship. All he could do now was sit and wait for high tide, hoping and praying that the ship was now light enough to be lifted free from the reef. As the tide rose slowly, the men waited with bated breath, and the Endeavour gradually, inch by inch, was lifted from the coral. She was afloat, but her troubles were far from over.
At 9 o'clock, the ship righted and the leak gained considerably. This was an alarming and I may say terrible circumstance and threatened immediate destruction to us as soon as the ship was afloat.
By now, the water in the hold was over 1 metre deep, and even by frantically manning 3 pumps, they couldn't hold the water back. Cook just had to find a way of plugging that hole. Cook ordered his men to take an old sail and sew straw to it before covering the straw with dung to make the sail sticky. This was then tied to a rope, thrown overboard and carefully manoeuvred into place over the leak. The water pressure then forced it onto the hole like a giant plug. It would do the job, for now. The water was kept back long enough for the Endeavour to limp into a bay for repair. But now, Cook was trapped by the perils of the Barrier Reef. Cook was really up against it at this point. I mean, he had a jury-rigged repair. I mean, what's it like to navigate around there even now?
Well, even today, with all the sophisticated electronic equipment we have on boats like Deep Star, we still have to navigate through the Great Barrier Reef with extreme caution. You know, there's a saying, there's 2 types of skippers, Paul. Those who have hit the reef and those who will. And if you drop your guard, you could be in serious trouble. It's unforgiving out there.
What about you? Have you hit it?
A long time ago, yes.
So you've had yours?
I have. I was against the tides, and fortunately enough, we had a winch on the after deck of the vessel, and we were close to shore, so we managed to wind this wire around a coconut tree to pull us off. But poor Jimmy, I don't think he had those facilities back then.
All Cook did have at his disposal were his formidable skills as a navigator. He knew that to return home, he had to find a way through the treacherous reef that hemmed him in and stretched as far as the eye could see. To get through would take all of Cook's ingenuity. And here's what he came up with. You see these waves over here? They mean that the reef comes very close to the surface and making the water really shallow. What Cook needed to find was a place where there were no breaking waves, because that would mean deeper water and maybe a gap that he could get Endeavour through. Cook eventually spotted a gap in the reef and decided to sail through. He had no choice. It was that or be trapped within the reef forever. This was an incredibly risky manoeuvre. We're picking our way through now on this big modern boat with 2 whopping great engines. The Endeavour was a huge wooden ship with sail power only, no engines. She was at the mercy of the winds, the tide and the current. Cook would just have to pick his time and go for it. With great skill and daring, Cook made it through the reef. The Endeavour could now continue her journey home. For 11 months she sailed onward, heading from New South Wales to the East Indies, round the southern tip of Africa, and then north towards Europe. Finally, on the 12th of July 1771, she anchored at Deal in Kent after 3 years at sea. It had been a truly historic expedition. Cook had become the first man ever to circumnavigate the world in a lone ship, a phenomenal achievement. If that wasn't enough, he hadn't lost a single man to scurvy, an unheard of record. He had joined the ranks of the few who had discovered new lands, and he had claimed a new country, Australia, for Britain. At last, Cook's name was made. The Admiralty recognised his huge talents and finally promoted him to the rank of captain. Cook was now a hero. Even the original scientific mission proved to be a resounding success. Despite Cook's misgivings, his results would turn out to be vital. In 1771, the astronomer Thomas Hornsby took 5 of the measurements from various locations around the world, including Tahiti, and averaged them out. Cook's measurements were essential to allow Hornsby to calculate the distance of the Earth from the Sun, and the result was astonishingly accurate. He came up with a figure of 151 million kilometres, incredibly close to today's accepted figure of 150 million kilometres from the Earth to the Sun. And this became the yardstick for measuring distance in the solar system. And as a voyage of discovery, the expedition had been incredibly successful. Cook had found 40 new islands. He'd discovered that New Zealand was in fact 2 islands, and he'd mapped the east coast of Australia, claiming it for Britain. Importantly, Cook's voyage of discovery pretty much proved that the great southern continent was a fantasy. And crucially, he rewrote the map of the world. And these achievements were only possible because of Cook's particular style of leadership. As one of his colleagues wrote, he was cool and deliberate in judging, active in executing, unsubdued by difficulties and disappointments, mild, just and exact in discipline. He was a father to his people. Cook would go on to make 2 more extraordinary voyages, but it was this first journey aboard Endeavour that would really make his name. And by the time of his death in 1779, Cook had become a legend. He'd explored more of the planet than anyone else in history. And for me, this naval nobody became one of the greatest explorers of all time.
Captain Cook had a sailing ship, pump ship, packet ship, sailing on a cruising ship in the South Pacific. Cook found Venus through his glass, pump ship, packet ship. The men found Venus in the grass in the South Pacific. Then they hit a coral reef, pump ship, packet ship, caused him just a scoff of grief in the South Pacific. Sailed back to the old country, pump ship, packet ship, the first international celebrity in the South Pacific.
Thank you. Thanks, James. What do you think of that?